Welcome to UPARS LA. My name is Steve Murillo. I'm the State Section Director for UPARS LA, the UFO and Paranormal Research Society of Los Angeles, the one and only. This is October 2016, and tonight we have a very special guest, Mike Bara. I'm sure many of you recognize Mike from his television series, Ancient Aliens. Well, let me go into the Uncovered Aliens. Mike is a New York Times bestselling author, lecturer, and TV personality. He began his writing career after spending more than 25 years as an engineer and consultant for major aerospace companies. He is a self-described born-again conspiracy theorist. His first book, Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA, was written in 2007, co-authored by Richard C. Hoagland, who many of you know as the gentleman that introduced the Mars and all of the artifacts on Mars. His second book was The Choice, which contains theories about hyperdimensional physics, planetary formation, conscious thought, and how they relate to the Mayan calendar. Mike's written 6 books since Dark Mission. He's been on TV many times, many different shows. So we're very lucky to have him here. And you guys are lucky because his Hidden Agenda book just came out. This is the first print. The first books sold were tonight. So if you guys want to get a copy of this book, they'll be available after the show, and you can talk to Mike and get him to sign it for you. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Mike Bara.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. I think it's really great that this number of people thought this was the coolest thing to do on a Tuesday night in LA. So appreciate you guys all coming. I got to tell you a story real quick before I get up here. The Choice he mentioned is a book that I really am proud of. It's like my favorite book, probably. Well, the new one is always your favorite book, right? Because that's the one you're trying to sell. But The Choice is one of my favorite books because in it I predicted a bunch of things that were going to happen and that I felt would happen between 2010 and 2023. And one of the big ones was that there would be a lot of political upheaval and instability. And I think as we go through this particular political cycle, I mean, I didn't specifically predict Trump, but I basically said this was going to happen. People are getting into a revolutionary mode. And, yesterday I come up with a line I thought was pretty great. Every so often I come up with something like, wow, that was really cool, I'm going to tweet that. And it was, you're only a conspiracy theorist until WikiLeaks proves you right. And then you're not a conspiracy theorist anymore. So all of you crazy conspiracy theorists out there, remember, sooner or later, it'll all come true. So we're in a period of real change, and a lot of strange things are going on. Today, on my way down here, I got molested by TSA. And it was the really, I really hate that fascist crap, this whole airport thing, it really sucks. And, I didn't have my TSA pre-check because, Steve paid for the ticket and it was, wasn't a first class ticket. I'm just kidding, it's great. But, so I go through and I have to go to this stupid body scanner thing, right? And so, me, I always like to kind of do this. They tell you to put your hands over your head, and I like to kind of do this as I put my hands over my head. So I did that. So they pulled me aside after that. They said, "Well, sir, we got to give you a pat down here. We got to pat you down, and we're really sorry about this. Do you want to do it in private, or should we do it in public?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't care. Let's just do it here. I want to get on my plane. I want to get on my way." So I look over at the little scanner and the things that it's identified that need to be checked out on me, and it's my right butt cheek, and I swear to God, my crotch. Okay, my crotch is like dee, dee, dee. So this guy feels up my rear end, comes up my leg, gives me the old, prison crossover, and I'm just sitting there thinking, this is ridiculous. I mean, why don't we just profile people that are likely to be terrorists, like the Israelis do? The Israelis haven't had a problem with their aircraft being hijacked in 30 or 40 years because that's what they do. And I just think we're in a really bizarre time right now, and things are going to get very bizarre. I don't know what's going to happen in the election. I think if the election is straightforward, that I think Donald Trump will win. If it's not straightforward, I think Hillary will win. If it is, it could be that it gets sort of stolen, but it's so obvious that it's stolen that there's practically a revolution. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. I've talked to people in, that tell me things, that know stuff, that know people in the government, and they say, oh, this is all decided, and this is all just a cover for some other really big thing that's going to happen that they're going to try to cover up. And there have been rumors that one or both of the candidates at some point is going to drop out of the race. That there's going to be some scandal that's so overwhelming, or somebody's going to get sick and collapse. I'll give you 3 guesses who that is. And, I keep hearing these things. And it's like I'm watching, I'm kind of waiting. Hillary had that episode. And I thought, is she going to drop out now? And she didn't. And then Trump had this whole big thing, and that didn't kill him. So I don't know what's going on. I think that one of the last things I've heard is that what's actually going to happen is Trump is going to win the popular vote and Hillary's going to win the Electoral College. And the whole thing is going to start some sort of craziness. But the point is that we're all here because we're kind of conspiracy theorists. We don't believe what the government tells us. We don't believe that things are as they appear to be on reality TV, speaking as somebody who did some reality TV. What's going to happen is going to be a cover for something else. So the one thing I wanted to say in my big soapbox speech is when something crazy does happen, if it does happen, what we have to be aware of is to look around for the other things that are being super underreported under the radar. That's the really big deal, and that should tell us what direction this whole, not just country, but the whole world is going. I mean, it's kind of scary because there's more war talk now than there ever has been before. I mean, Hillary's talking about, bombing Russia. It's a little crazy. So that is not what I'm here to talk about tonight, however. We're here to talk about aliens and UFOs. I'm not taking sides on this. If you look at my Facebook or look at my Twitter, you probably know who I want to win. But that's only if these people are who they appear to be. If they are playing roles, then there's something else going on. So, I've got a new book out. It's called Hidden Agenda, NASA and the Secret Space Program, which I came up with, decided I wanted to write this last year. And this is my 7th book now. I've written a bunch of other ones: Dark Mission, The Choice, Ancient Aliens on the Moon, Ancient Aliens on Mars, Ancient Aliens on Mars 2, and Ancient Aliens and Secret Societies was last year. I got a couple copies of that one back there, and I've got more copies of Hidden Agenda. So, but I have to save a few for MUFON OC, because I'm doing them tomorrow. I'm going to go down and lecture down there. And you guys are going to get the better lecture, I'll just tell you that right now. This is always, the second day I'm always, I go out drinking with Jose Escamilla, and I drink tequila, and my second lecture is never as good as the first one. Jose's back there. Everybody say hi to Jose when you get a chance. He's a wonderful guy. Yeah, we all love him. So, how I got interested, a couple other things I wanted to talk about. I wish this was a little bit bigger, but one of the things, the best things you can do for people who write books, I know you've had a lot of authors here, and Nick Redfern's been here, right, and other people like that come. This is like one of the best UPARS groups. It's not a MUFON group anymore, but this is one of the best groups around. And everybody loves to come here and speak, and we all have our books on Amazon, and Hidden Agenda is available on Amazon right now. But I went in there just the other day, because it just finally came out, finally got into the bookstores this week, and it's on Amazon. And there's a couple of reviews from a couple of jerks. One of them is James Oberg. Anybody know who James Oberg is? He looks like Stimpy from Ren and Stimpy. Remember Ren and Stimpy? He used to work for NASA, and he's a total shill. He's just a debunker. And this other guy who's obsessed with me. I know he's got a poster of me at home with me built like Sean Paul. Where's Sean? Anyway, and I just know he's got some attraction to me. But one of the things I wanted to tell you that's really important is if you read the book and you like the book, please do me the favor and do all of the authors a favor of going in and writing a review on Amazon and giving it the stars you think it deserves. If you think it sucks, go ahead and give it one. Well, no, if you think it sucks, don't do a review. But if you don't, then do a review. It doesn't have to be very long or complicated, but go ahead and do that. And what's also really important is that there's these really negative reviews out there. And these guys are debunkers. They do this on all my work. They do it on other people's products too. But what's really important is it says, was this review useful? Did you find this review useful? And it says yes or no. And what's really important is do not say no on this. Do not click on this at all, because what Amazon does is the reviews that get the most activity on these yes or no's are the ones they put at the top. So what we want you to do is, if you like the book, write a good review, and then go around and look at the other good reviews and say yes, but do not click no on the ones that you don't like. That's really important for getting, the more good reviews you have, the more books you sell, and the more of us can do these things. And come out and entertain you guys. Also, I'm going to be redoing my website a little bit here. It's you can't really read it, but it's mikebara.blogspot.com. Last time I checked, you can just Google Mike Bara with one R, and it gives you this site at the top, also a bunch of other crazy stuff about me that's not true. But what I'm going to be adding to this is I've written a novel that I really like that I have yet to get published, which is really irritating to me. But I'm going to start serializing that on the website, and also some screenplays that I've written that I just want to put some fiction stuff on there because I do a lot of that too. And so if you go to the website, you're going to be getting more and more of that. Boy, I was really skinny when that picture was taken. I love it. I love it when Contact in the Desert and these other people, use the old pictures from 5 years ago for me. I gotta hit the gym. Anyway, so I'll be doing some upgrades to the website, adding some new things that you guys can get that I hope you'll enjoy, and I'd like to get your comments on. So please go ahead and do that. Okay, so tonight's subject is the secret space program. And how I got started on this was that I keep hearing about the secret space program, right? And even my former writing partner, not life partner, but writing partner, Richard Hoagland, some of you found that funny, talked about the secret space program, but everybody's version of the secret space program is different. And some of them don't even have any evidence to support it. They just talk about all this stuff that people have told them. And I begin to think about it, really begin to irritate me, because I was thinking, there's got to be some meat to this. There has to be something behind all this. But as I started to look around, all the information was sort of diffuse. It wasn't ever put together. So what I wanted to do was write a book that would take what I thought was the best evidence that there was some sort of secret space program and put it into a book and see if there really is a reason to believe in this stuff. Now, what's really interesting to me is that when you talk about the secret space program, you hear about some of the ancient airship, not ancient, but old-time airship stories, the Foo Fighters of World War II, the Nazi flying saucers, and the question for me was, how much validity is there to any of this stuff? Well, as I dug into it, what I found out was that back in the day, that in Germany, or specifically pre-Germanic Prussia, there was a lot of interest in flying machines in the 1800s, especially the early 1800s. And what I think was going on was that you had the top physicists and industrialists at the time, the guys who were multi-billionaires, in today's dollars, that were fascinated by the idea of flying machines. And they began to look at the ancient texts, the Mahabharata, or however you pronounce it, all these ancient, Vedic texts and other information from Egypt and some of the stuff Sitchin's talked about. They looked at this information with the eyes of a physicist. And they begin to understand that what they were reading about in these flying machines and these angels was actually aliens and spacecraft. And they begin to think, I wonder if we could recreate those or bring that technology back, or perhaps make it our own, reclaim that which was once ours. So, in a sense, the flying saucers, the Nazi saucers, I think were ultimately inspired by the Vimanas and some of the early ideas. Now, the basis for this is that there appears to be, and a lot of the credit has to go to, sorry about the peas there, folks. A lot of the credit has to go to a friend of mine named Olaf Phillips, who I worked with on a TV show called Deep Space, that's on Gaia right now, Gaia TV. It's not Gaiam anymore, it's now Gaia, is that right? I don't know why they changed that, but they changed it. And one of the things that was discovered was that in Prussia in the 1800s, there apparently was a secret society about which very little is known, but it was called NIMZA, or Nimzimza with a J, NIMZA, N-Y-M-Z-A. And there are a lot of different translations for what that might have meant, but the standard one that's been come up with is that it stood for the National Exploratory Airship Program Office. And it was financed and organized by some very, very famous physicists and industrialists, people like Willem Weber and Maximus von Imhoff and Rudolf Kohlenbausch. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the German names because I will screw them up. But these guys were involved with these wealthy, mysterious Prussian industrialists. And they began to develop this idea of building airships that at that time, there really wasn't flight. There were some balloons in the early 1800s, but they were not controllable, and they tended to crash into trees and burn and kill people. Now, where this was all centered was actually an area of Prussia called Silesia at the time. It's still, at times, it's called Silesia. I think today it's part of modern-day Poland. But at the time, this is the area where a lot of these guys lived and were developing all this technology. It's a very interesting area. It's got a long history. There was a Roman legion completely wiped out, one of Octavian's legions in right around 40 BC, 35 BC. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in this area, and it seems to have a lot of weird mystical powers, at least the Germans used to think so. Now, as the story goes, Nimsa sent a Prussian man named Charles Dellschau to the United States in about 1850, I believe. Dellschau was born in 1830. He came to the United States, and when he came to the U.S., he entered through New York. The records show he then went on to Chicago, and then he went on to Houston, Texas. Then for 10 years, he disappears, and it is fairly well established that in those 10 years, he traveled from Houston, Texas, across the American Southwest. And remember, at the time, this is horse and buggy, right? So I presume he did it in the winter, because if he did it in the summer, he would have found out why they call this Death Valley. But he ended up in a place called Sonora, California, which is actually very near Sacramento, California. Well, if you consider 140 miles very near, but it's relatively near. Today, we would consider it a 2-hour drive, but at the time, it was a bit of a bigger deal. And then after 10 years, he comes back and ends up back in Houston, where he passes the rest of his days and passes away. He becomes a butcher, actually. But one of the interesting things about Dellschau is that he appears to have been a member of something that's known as the Sonora Air Club, and there is some substantial information to indicate there was this Sonora Air Club. Now, why you would have an air club in 1850s Sonora, California, don't ask me, but there were, interestingly, a lot of Prussian-German members of this. Gustav Freyr was one, another guy named Freund was one, and Charles Dellschau was one of the main members. Now, who was Dellschau? He was an engineer. He was a draftsman and an engineer. He did production illustration drawings. So when he got to Sonora, and then eventually came back, when he returned, he set about the task of making these beautiful pictures, paintings, and watercolors. What actually happened is they were stored in a house in Houston. There was a fire. They were thrown out on the curbside. Somebody drove by, liked them, picked them up, put them into a pawn shop, where eventually somebody else discovered them, found out whose they were, and thought that this guy was really interesting, and the books still actually exist today. This is one of the leather-bound books that he created. Now, what was in these books was a series of drawings that my background is aerospace engineering, and when I look at this is what we used to call a production illustration. Before we had 3D computers and did everything in 3D, we used to just draw things up. We used to make illustrated pictures, paintings. We had guys that were ink pen artists that actually drew the entire airplane in a kind of a 3D isometric perspective. All the bolts, all the nuts, everything that went in, so everybody would know how the plane went together. And that's very similar to what this is. This is one of Dellschau's paintings. That appears to be a propeller. There's landing gear. There's places for a crew. And he did dozens and dozens and dozens of these paintings. There's a couple more examples of his original artwork. And there are, I think, well over 100 different versions of these. Now, these, again, are not the fantastical flights of imagination of an artist. They're technical drawings. And I can look at them and tell you, as a guy who used to do technical drawing and do engineering, this is technical stuff. This is actual designs for aircraft. Now, the thing that's really curious, too, about that is that he also, as he drew this stuff, there was actually a code that he put in it. This is an example of these coded, weird, sort of runic symbols that he put on some of the pages that nobody can decipher to this day. It's really been since the 1960s that these drawings and paintings were discovered, and nobody has yet figured out the code, but he put them on many, many different pages as if it was meant for somebody who knew what the game was. Now, interestingly enough, there was an wave of airship sightings in the late 1890s, a lot of you probably know about this, that happened in the United States. It started in the western United States. And where it actually started was Sacramento, California. People started seeing balloon-type craft with propellers and some of them without propellers, moving around the sky and making maneuvers and flying under the controlled influence of some intelligence. This is an example of the San Francisco Call. It's got a painting of a craft that was sighted over Sacramento. This is another close-up of the sort of charcoal sketch that was done. This one had propellers, and it flew and maneuvered over the city of Sacramento, and it was seen by hundreds of people. And there's no question that this actually took place. Here's another example of one of the airships that was sighted. There's all these weird stories. There's stories of people saying that the airships landed on the ground. And there's one story where two 7-foot-tall beings that were extremely frail and thin came out and confronted a farmer on his farm after they landed on his farm. And they tried to grab him and drag him in, but they were too weak to drag him in, and he ran away and they left. And I'm like, what? Krill and Klaatu messed up their first abduction attempt. They're like, oh, maybe we need a stronger model or something. I don't know what the deal was, but there's a lot of weird stories that happened. Now, this flap was so intense that everybody began to suspect that there was some sort of industrialist or mastermind behind it. And the number one guy that was fingered was Edison. And it came to the point that Edison had to actually go to the New York Times and deny that he had any involvement in the airship flap that was going on. I didn't build airships. I'm not interested in airships. I think they're ridiculous. You can't make things fly. At that time, he said, no way, it's not me. I have nothing to do with it. He had an airship talk, gave an interview, said, no, forget it, it's not me. So he actually had to go out in public and deny that he had anything to do with these airship sightings. What's interesting is that in some of the literature that has still survived about this Sonora Air Club, there was a discovery by one of the members. He claimed he had discovered a gas that had anti-gravity effects. Now, it could be, hydrogen, which really wasn't discovered, but he called it, wasn't something new, but he called it NB gas. And he said it had anti-gravity properties, and it allowed them to make airships that could actually defy the forces of gravity, and that the propellers then were only used for maneuvering, for actually moving from one place to another. So it could be that these drawings are actually drawings of actual aircraft that Dellschau worked on or helped draft the engineering pieces for, and that they were out there in the desert in Sonora actually building and testing these airships. So, one of the other famous cases that happened during the whole airship flap was the Aurora, Texas crash in 1897. And the story goes that some sort of airship crashed into a windmill on a farmer's farm, and it broke up into pieces, that it was made of some very exotic metals, and there was an alien being who the newspaper stories say was not of this world, and was found dead in the crash, and he, along with the pieces of the spacecraft or aircraft, were buried there in Aurora, Texas. Well, nobody really did much investigation on this thing until 1973, when a couple of MUFON guys went to Aurora, Texas, started asking the local people, like, is this story true? Were taken out to the farm, found with a metal detector what they thought was the grave, because there was a headstone that had some sort of Christian writing on it, some sort of Christian saying, and it actually had metal bits beneath it. So they thought, well, maybe this is it, and they wanted to dig it up. But as they tried to dig it up, a bunch of the townsfolk came around with their shotguns and said, whatever is there is meant to be buried. It is not meant to be found by man, and you will not disturb it. They scared these guys off, and they ran away. They didn't get very far with their dig, and when they came back a few years later, it was all gone. So the thought is that somebody told the government about it, or the government found out about it because it was in the newspapers, and they went and they dug up the body and they dug up the material and they took it away. So that's the story of the Aurora, Texas crash. Now, what's really interesting again is Dellschau's travels were from Prussia to New York to Chicago to Houston to Sonora. Aurora's kind of along the way. And then what's interesting to me is that the airship flap starts in Sacramento, right near Sonora, goes back through to Phoenix, Arizona, over to Aurora, Texas, and back to Chicago before it kind of dies out around Chicago. There weren't really too many sighted after that. So what's fascinating to me is it looks like that Dellschau goes out here, spends 10 years working on these aircraft, these ideas, this idea for these airships. They make this breakthrough discovery of this gas with anti-gravity properties, and then they build these ships and fly them back. And where are they headed? I think they're headed back to Prussia. They're headed back to Germany. Now again, here's a couple of examples of things that Dellschau had drawn versus things that were actually sighted during the airship flap. And you know, this all sounds kind of weird, because if you look at those weird symbols that he encoded in his drawings, they seem kind of mystical. But remember, this idea that the scientist and the mystic are separate things, it's a pretty new concept. It's only been in about the last 100 years or so that the scientist and the mystic are two different guys, or have two opposing viewpoints. You know, you've got Carl Sagan versus, I don't know, Deepak Chopra, Greg Braden, me. You've got guys on one side that have, say, everything can be explained, then you have the mystics, but back in the day, it didn't used to be the case. Back in the 1800s, these two identities were mingled together, and they were used to create fantastic ideas, to imagine things that were unimaginable, and then go about the practical matter of constructing them. Of course, in World War II, we begin to see Zeppelins. We begin to see dirigibles fly around, actual balloons. They're very similar to some cigar-shaped UFOs that were seen in the 1920s. Were they powered by NB gas? Here's another photo there's been a lot of controversy over what this is, but it's from the same period, supposedly from a submarine, of a flying balloon-type craft. And of course, there's been more recent sightings of these cigar-shaped craft. The cigar shape is really common in UFOs because it seems to be like the motherships seem to be the cigar shapes. All the little scout craft are the flying discs, the saucers. And of course, after the destruction of the Hindenburg, which was, where did the Hindenburg come from? Was it Germany? Yeah, it was Germany, right? Yeah, Germany. The whole idea of the airship and the balloon and the dirigible kind of went by the wayside. So during that same period, there was a growth of this mysticism that was happening in Germany, in the Weimar Republic, early Nazi Germany, and it was led by the Vril Society. And the Vril Society was led in many ways by this particular woman, and her name is Maria Orsic. And as you can see, she's very Germanic, very Aryan, it's very beautiful. There's no kids here, right? Nope, no kids. Okay, so they had a lot of weird mystical ideas. This is another picture of Maria Orsic. There's only 3 pictures that are known to actually be of her. This is one of them. And they had incredibly long hair because they believed that the hair was a psychic antenna. So the longer a woman's hair was, and the women were more psychic than men, and that the longer a woman's hair was, the more she was connected to the Vril, or the energy of the earth and the energy of the universe, and the more she could be psychically connected. And this stuff was important in the development of technology, especially wartime technology. Here's another picture of Maria Orsic. So on the one hand, you've got this mystic. She's naked. She's not really naked. You've got the mystic with this incredibly long hair, doing all this psychic stuff, doing a bunch of readings, creating all of the stuff where she would do, channeled writing, where she would just write all kinds of interesting information in these weird symbols. And then you've got a guy like Charles Dellschau, who was an engineer, a practical guy. If you put the two of them together, they're what they represent. You put them together and you have the ability to create really, really exotic, weird technologies. Again, even down to the body positioning and stuff. All this stuff coming from the Nazis was all about aligning chakras and all that stuff. The nudity's done now. But what's really interesting is that if you look at what Maria Orsic wrote, all of her channel communications, here's a couple of examples, versus what Dellschau created, which was these codes. They're very similar, and what they appear to be is runic symbols. The Germans are big on these runes, right? It kind of comes from the Norse gods, and these ideas that symbols have certain power, and that power can be applied to enhance technology. So that was the idea behind what both Dellschau and the Vril Society seem to be going for. So you have this stuff coming. Here's a runic alphabet of all these different weird symbols that are supposed to have different magical powers. Now, you fast forward a little bit to the 1930s. Now, Hitler's come to power in Germany. Einstein decides to get the hell out and go to America because he sees the writing on the wall. But another guy named Erich Schaumann joins the Nazi Party, becomes, I think, a colonel in the German army, and he's also a physicist, and he had been working on some of the stuff that Einstein had been working on, as well as a guy named Eli Cartan. And they came up with what's called the Einstein-Cartan theory. Now, what their theory was, and this is the boring part, what their theory is that there is something called a metric tensor torsion field. That is how the universe works. What I talk about in the choice is that, right now they say there's 4 forces that operate in the universe. A strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, gravity, and electromagnetism. What I argue, and I think people like David Wilcock argue, is that there's a 5th force that's not discovered or well known, which is called dynamic torsion. And basically it's a twisting, spiraling of everything in the physical universe. Physical space itself twists. And this is basically what Einstein and Cartan had started on. And after they left, it was all based on vortexes, and this kind of looks a little bit like a swastika. And the swastika symbol is actually kind of built on this. Now, after Einstein left Germany, Schaumann picked up his work and began to develop this idea of using spin forces and angular momentum developed by spinning objects to create lift, to create anti-gravity forces. By the way, I flew down here on a plane today, and I want to let everybody know who's going to be flying that having worked in aerospace for years, I can tell you that nobody knows why airplanes fly. Nobody knows. The myth is that the air pressure difference between the top of the wing and the bottom of the wing makes the plane go up. But they've tested that over and over again, and there's still a missing 5 or 10% of lift that they cannot account for. And they never have, and they've been working on this since the 1930s. So just so you know, there's all kinds of mystical forces at work. All we know is that if we build an airfoil of a certain shape and we push it forward fast enough, the sucker will go up. That's all we know. It's scary. You actually work, I worked at Boeing for years. You go in, and Boeing is famous. The thing that they do different than other aerospace companies is they write everything down in what they call these design manuals. You want to know how to build an airplane? Just go steal Boeing's design manuals. It tells you how to do everything. But it's interesting because it talks about structure. It talks about how it collapses. And it said right in there, I mean, it just freaked me out when I first read it. It said, we don't really know why metal structures will fail under these particular circumstances. We just know that if you design it with this shape and at this thickness and with this ratio, it won't. So there's all kinds of things in physics that nobody has the answer to. They just seem to be things that happen. Now, in World War II, there's lots of stories about something called the Nazi bell. You guys may have seen the Nazi bell. It's been related to the Kecksburg acorn. What's similar or interesting about them to me is that they both were said to have these weird runic symbols on them, as if they were technological devices that also needed some mystical element to make them work. Now, the bell is pretty fascinating. There's a lot of stories about it. Here's another drawing of it, that it was this sort of weird bell-shaped structure that was used in test rigs, but it had a lot of really interesting effects. In fact, the test rig does still seem to exist. It's in Prussia, in Silesia, this area that we talked about before. This is where the bell was tested. And this is the only part of it that appears to be left, is the actual test rig structure that was designed to hold this thing when it was being tested. Now, where that location is, again, is right back here in Silesia or Prussia, which is now part of Poland. And so you've got this connection back to this one place on Earth where all this stuff happened. Maria Orsic, too. She did a lot of her rituals and things went on in that part of Germany before it was Germany, or after it was Germany. Now, there are some pictures of this area right here. And Dr. Joseph Farrell has written a couple books. I'll talk about him in a second. But this is a picture of what this area supposedly was, which is a power plant or a rubber plant. The idea was supposedly that where the bell was being researched, there was a rubber plant there, making rubber seals for battleships and tanks and things like that. This rubber plant was using 1/6 of all of Germany's electrical resources in the last 2 years of the war. So I don't really think it was a rubber plant. The fly trap that's identified here, they think is that test rig. It was out there in the open. I don't know why you'd need that if you were, if it was like for a water tower, as some people say. Okay, so one of the things that caught my eye years ago, after I read Joe's books, was I was always fascinated by General Patton. There's a great old movie from the 70s called Patton. George C. Scott won an Academy Award if you've ever seen it. It's probably the greatest war movie of all time. And one of the things that's really interesting is that Patton was obsessed with winning the war, being the biggest hero in the war. So as the U.S. had invaded Normandy, but they were trapped right after that in the hedgerow country of Normandy. They couldn't break out. Patton had been disgraced because he slapped a soldier and called him a coward and a bunch of stuff like that. And they finally said, look, we're screwed here. The Germans are kicking our butts. We got to do something, so let's bring Patton back. So Patton came back, and he took over the Third Army, and he broke out and swept around and went all the way across France, into Belgium, Luxembourg, and crossed the Rhine River, which was the gateway to Germany, the last natural barrier of Germany. And then they stopped him. Now, politically, logically, what you would do is once you cross the Rhine, you would want to go to Berlin. Because you go to Berlin, you take Berlin before the Russians do, you win the political battle, you win the public relations battle, and you put an end to the Nazi government. And you take all the glory. But Patton instead, once he broke through the Rhine, was not only stopped, he was ordered to divert his forces south directly toward Silesia and the area where this plant was built. Now, Hitler at the time was telling his generals that they had to protect this area, not Berlin, because this was where they were developing the secret wonder weapons that would end the war for Germany. Now, Germany may have had a couple of atomic bombs. They may have used one of them on the Russians. But the bottom line is, atomic bombs, unless you had 50 or 100 of them, were not going to turn the war in Germany's favor. So he was not talking about the atom bomb. He was talking about something else. The question is, what was he talking about? And logically, it seems to be that he was talking about the Nazi bell. Now, the bell was pretty bizarre. It apparently was chained to this test rig, and when it was activated, it actually levitated off the ground. So it basically did things that kind of defied gravity. And when it hit people, apparently, it was really bad for people that were around it. It supposedly melted their skin. It destroyed everything biological within a certain radius. Sorry, this is Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's okay, right? It's 20 years old. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's a picture of Hillary for tomorrow night's debate. Sorry, I know there's probably some Hillary supporters here. I don't mean to be. Yeah, go ahead and kiss me. She doesn't look good, though, does she? She doesn't look good. Does anybody here? Does anybody here doubt that she's really sick? I mean,
she's a clone.
Okay, sorry I asked that question. We'll move on. Yeah, I've heard that one too. She's a clone. Trump's a clone. Can you imagine multiple Trumps? Wow. Suck the air out of the room. So, in this test rig, they developed this test rig, and they put the bell inside of it. This is what it would have looked like if it was actually placed inside the actual test rig. That was about the relative size. And, when it did activate, it levitated. It had a bunch of different effects, very similar to these Vimanas, which were described. And it's really interesting because these things were described in excruciating detail in some of these Indian texts. I mean, they talk about the metal alloys that you have to use to construct Vimanas. It's like people want to blow these things off as, it's just sort of the fantastical ramblings of people that are just being mystical and trying to, and having fantasies. But I mean, they specifically tell you how to construct these craft right down to how to manufacture the nuts and the bolts and the materials that are used. I mean, it's like literally, again, it's like reading an aerospace design manual from the 20th century. So, and of course, the Vimanas were based on this idea of using different forces to actually lift the craft. And they all had these very similar sort of tower shapes that are not too different from the bell. Now, at the same time going on in Germany, there was another guy named Victor Schauberger who basically said that he had mastered physical movement. And he said things like, we're doing things the wrong way. We're trying to push airplanes when they should be pulled. That a fish doesn't swim, it is swum. And a bird does not fly, it is flown. In other words, there were natural forces at work that could be taken advantage of, that could be used to actually create lift and anti-gravity effects. And he developed what he called the repulsing. Now, this is a picture, a model that he made of the repulsing. I'm really hitting it with the piece tonight, aren't I? What does it look like to you? Come on, audience participation. Thank you, flying saucer. Thanks, Jose. It looks like a flying saucer. And the idea was he would use all these different sort of exotic twisting, roiling, again, this sort of twisting motion, torsional motion of air to actually create lift and control. And all of his designs were classic looking flying saucers that ended up looking kind of like what the Nazis built at the end of World War II. So again, here's an example of high-speed rotors and things that were used to create this effect. But what I always thought was really interesting is that the idea behind the repulsing was that you could control the vectoring of this object in any direction with great precision. And remember what the problem was with the balloons. They could make the balloons, but they couldn't control them without propellers. If you put propellers on them, they're going to be kind of slow. So those balloons, even if they have anti-gravity gas in them, they're not going to move around very well. So this presented the opportunity to actually create structures or objects, structural objects, that could fly in a controlled way. Here's a couple of other shots of different repulsing designs that Schauberger tested. And again, he was German. So it occurs to me that what you could do is you could maybe take something like the bell and use it for another purpose. Now, again, I'm going to really pump out these two books to you. This is Dr. Joseph Farrell's Reich of the Black Sun, which talks about the fact that Patton, for instance, was stopped from going to Berlin and instead sent to Silesia. The SS Brotherhood of the Bell, I would say pick these two up. They're in the catalogs that are back there that David Childers sent me. You guys know David Hatcher Childers from Ancient Aliens. So he's my publisher, and this is his catalog, Adventures Unlimited Press, and it's really cool. There's a ton of good books in it. But one of the things that Farrell talked about that I think is really cool is in here, he basically argues, I think very successfully, that the two atomic bombs the U.S. dropped on Japan were not American, they were German. America didn't have enough uranium to actually build an atomic bomb, nor did we have the nuclear triggers necessary to detonate them. But we captured a submarine, the U-235, that was on its way to Japan, and we got German uranium, enriched uranium, and German triggers. So these are fascinating books to read. Actually, Reich of the Black Sun's great for about 3/4 of the way, and then I fall asleep usually, but it's great. Anyway, the idea behind the bell was that it used this sort of weird, red, viscous sort of liquid to help create this lifting or anti-gravity effect, and it was called Zerum 525 in some of the documentations that were created. But today, I think we would call it something known as red mercury. Now, red mercury is this very mysterious substance. Wikipedia says it doesn't exist. Wikipedia says lots of things. And the idea is that you would create these sort of counter-rotating fields, magnetic fields with it, and it would create lift. Now, what I've always wondered is, and what I believe is that the NB gas is actually the Zerum 525 or red mercury, that this is what they discovered way back at the Sonora Air Club back in the United States. Now, one other thing to talk about the Sonora Air Club, Germany was populated. It wasn't highly populated back in the 1800s, but if you think about why would they send Dellschau all the way to the United States, well, it's the same reason we have Area 51 and secret bases out in the Nevada desert right now in California, because these places were virtually unpopulated and there was no autocratic government that was watching over everything that people did. So if you were going to go develop secret aircraft, the perfect place to do it would be in the American West, especially back in the 1800s. So anyway, the design was something like this. You had these really, really large magnets. They were rotating around very fast. Again, the rotation thing is a major aspect of it. And you mix in this red mercury stuff, Zerum 525, NB gas, whatever you want to call it, and you got anti-gravity effects out of it. And that's what happened is then the bell would then lift up off the ground. Now, what it occurred to me is that the bell, people used to think that the bell was a craft itself. I don't think so. I think the bell was just the reactor. It was just the thing that created the anti-gravity effect. But remember, they had to chain this thing to keep it from flying off into space. So if you took this, however, and you put this Nazi bell reactor inside of a flying saucer shape, like Schauberger's repulsing, you would have this very familiar flying saucer shape with the dish-shaped body and the cupola and the reactor inside of it in the central core. And then, using the repulsing technology and the lift from the reactor, you could actually control the movements of this Nazi flying saucer. And it also might generate a dampening field into which people could actually survive these incredible high-speed maneuvers that they used to do. So, or that they were known to do. So there are a number of pictures of Nazi flying saucers. When I went on the Ancient Alien cruise about a month ago with David Hatcher Childress, and we had a long talk about these pictures before he published the book, and he says he's dug into these pictures and he's pretty convinced that these are legitimate photos of actual craft that the Nazis built. Now, I don't know if that's true, but they certainly apparently developed or wanted to develop these types of craft. Now, these things below here, they're kind of round and everybody thinks they might be like lift generators or something. Looks to me like they're just gun turrets. But this is the classic Nazi flying saucer look. They're called Hannenbaus. There's a bunch of different pictures of these things operating, apparently under test by Nazi Germany. Now, this whole secret development program was going on in Silesia, was run by this guy, a guy named Hans Kammler. Now, Hans Kammler is a really interesting figure because in the actual records of his military record in the United States Intelligence Service, he died. It's listed that he died. The problem is he's listed as having died 4 different times. There are 4 different official explanations of his death. Now, he was in charge of the super secret, he was the SS Obergruppenführer, which, by the way, when I get married, I'm going to make my wife call me the Obergruppenführer of my house. That's what I want to be. I want to be the Obergruppenführer, which means Overgruppenführer. And they developed different secret technologies like the bell and like these different Haunabus. Haunabu 1, Haunabu 2, they were progressively larger, more powerful flying saucer. This, by the way, is not Hans Kammler. I think that's Marlon Brando in a Nazi uniform from some movie he made. While he's on this graphic, I don't know. But it kind of looks like Kammler, so it works for me. So the idea is that they developed more and more powerful reactors, better bells, and then they would put them on bigger and bigger craft and be able to create, control, and develop this Nazi space fleet. And, of course, the question always is, where did they get them from? Well, thank God we have proof. Because of WikiLeaks, we have this picture of the people who gave the Nazis the technology. Yeah. Now, that sounds really stupid. And this picture is fun, but it's probably from National Enquirer or something, right? By the way, I hear National Enquirer's got an interesting story tomorrow. But it's interesting because there's different TV shows. Like, to me, I always want to look at what's going on in the media, because even the so-called fictionalized media, because they get fed stuff. I mean, one of the things that WikiLeaks is showing is that certain stories are being fed to the press by different sides in the political battles. Mostly the left, but they're being fed and they're being put out there. And they also do this. I talk about this in the book, Hidden Agenda and Acid and Secret Space. Actually, the book's a lot more interesting than its talk. I just want you to know that. It gets, that these things get fed. I mean, supposedly there's a story where Reagan told Steven Spielberg after watching Close Encounters in the White House, it's like, that's pretty close to the way things went down, Steve. So, sorry, that was my best Reagan. Nobody remembers Reagan anymore. Thank you. I thought it was pretty good. By the way, I have a really incredible Ronald Reagan story to tell you sometime if you ever want to hear it. That was told to me by Jordan Maxwell, it was told to him by Shirley MacLaine. And, in Star Trek Enterprise, which is a really crappy Star Trek show that killed the whole franchise, but there was one thread they had running through where there were aliens, evil aliens that were actually working with the Nazis in World War II, and they were developing secret technologies to try to change the timeline of Earth and all this stuff. And they were building these Bell reactors all through Nazi Germany. So this stuff found itself embedded into the popular culture, and I'm like, well, what's going on here? And they even built, Nazi flying saucer technology. It even shows this on the show as being helped by aliens. And that was how they eventually developed, supposedly, these craft. This is supposed to be the first prototype flying saucer, probably had something like the bell inside of it, and was a disc-shaped craft. And the disc shape is very important for having control over the direction of the spacecraft or the aircraft. There's another pictures from the development and testing of this, supposedly. This one I'm not so sure about. This picture looks pretty authentic to me. It looks like something from the World War II period. Here's another picture of a plane, German plane, that's a Junkers JU something, flying along this flying saucer, escorting it. And this is taken from another airplane, supposedly. And there's all different photographs of different configurations and designs, test designs of Nazi flying saucers that came out over the years. So that stuff I find really interesting. Now, around the same period of time, we had an extraordinary event that happened in Los Angeles. I think there might be somebody in this room who knows a little bit about this. Is there? Jose, do you know anything about this?
No.
Okay, so if I get something wrong, shout me down. But in 1942, right after the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, there was this incredible event that took place in Los Angeles. And basically what happened is that something was spotted on radar flying up the coast from Long Beach, and it was shot at by every anti-aircraft battery all along the coast here. Thousands and thousands of shells. And there's really actually one really good picture from the LA Times. This is just to prove to you it was in the LA Times, of this object. And as you look at this object, it is pretty clearly a disc-shaped craft. These are spotlights, and this is anti-aircraft fire. And they shot shell after shell after shell after shell at this thing, and they all just bounced off. No effect whatsoever. There were a couple people killed, right, Jose?
6 people died, yeah.
By shells being, shot over and landing in town somewhere. And, the interesting thing is that they look more like the Nazi saucers than they do like sort of classic flying saucers that came along later. You can see the basic disc shape here and the dome, the cupola, kind of like that. Now, there are also lots of other sightings of craft during this period. In World War II, we had the Foo Fighters. They were not the band, not the Dave Grohl band, but they were called Foo Fighters, and they were basically balls of light that flew around Allied aircraft and even some German aircraft and Russian aircraft and kind of spooked them. And nobody really knows what they were, but they were very similar in that they had this sort of very nebulous kind of shape. Here's an actual picture of a Foo Fighter taken from a U.S. bomber. I think there's a couple more shots here of them. There's very few that exist. But they were officially investigated by the United States Army at the time and the Army Air Force, and they basically said, something really weird's happening there. We don't know what it is, but they were definitely a phenomenon that was considered genuine and real. Now, there were other shapes and designs that came along. Here's another photograph of what supposedly is a UFO from this period around the time of World War II. So these things apparently existed. They apparently were observed. They were, in some cases, photographed. Here's some more Foo Fighters, gun turret photos of UFOs during World War II. And then, right after World War II, after the war ended, the story goes that Hans Kammler, or Marlon Brando, and his buddies took off in a very, very large plane built by the Heinkel Company that went to Norway, collected some more technology, and then flew to South America, from which they then U-boated down to secret German bases in Antarctica. There's an area of Antarctica called New Schwabenland, or it was called New Schwabenland. I think only recently, only a few years ago, they took it off the official maps of Antarctica, this area called New Schwabenland, that the Nazis claimed for Germany. And the story goes that when the Nazis got there, they found the secret entrance to the underground world, the underground tunnels, and they went there in their submarines and met with the aliens who live inside the Earth. That's the story. All I know is that after World War II, there was something called Operation High Jump. And Operation High Jump was a large military task force that was sent to Antarctica. It was full of all kinds of stuff. There were ships, there was an aircraft carrier, there were a couple destroyers, there were some tankers, there were, what's the other ship? Supply ships, icebreakers, and several other vehicles, and they were all under the command of General Byrd. This guy right here, who was the #1 Arctic fighter in the U.S. at the time. Now, when they got to Antarctica, they basically built a base, did some stuff for a few months, and then got the hell out. And what really happened is that they built this base on one side of Antarctica. I hesitate to say the southern tip because that's the southern tip right in the middle. It's weird, But this is New Schwabenland. This is where the Germans made their discoveries, supposedly. And this is where we landed in Antarctica with Operation High Jump. And then right after that, we basically sent 2 separate task forces in kind of a double pincer movement around. Anybody have you have a AAA battery there, guys? I'm running out of steam here. towards this New Schwabenland area. And the story goes that when they got there, they were met by flying saucers with cannons and machine guns, conventional weapons, unconventional craft that were so fast they could not be stopped. They attacked the forces of General Byrd, dealt them a very severe blow, and were also accompanied by Nazi U-boats. They had Nazi insignia on them. And here's supposedly a photograph from one of the boats of one of the flying discs near the destroyer. Here's another photo similar to the one I showed you before of supposedly what took place in the Antarctic operations. And basically what happened is that the U.S. forces got their butts kicked. And thank you. And they took off. And AAA, yeah, great. And they basically took off and left. Now, what's interesting is that they left because they said the weather was getting really bad. Okay, they got down there in January, and they left before the end of February. They got down there late in January, so they were there less than 6 weeks. In the Southern Hemisphere, that's the summertime. So it doesn't seem likely the weather really got worse from January to February. They're at the height of summer. That would be like saying, we got there in July and the weather got really bad in August, so we had to leave. The weather didn't get bad. But after he got back, Admiral Richard Byrd made some interesting statements. He said, I don't want to unduly frighten anybody in an interview, but it is a bitter reality that in the case of a new war, the continental United States would be attacked by flying objects which could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Sounds to me like he's describing what he observed down in Antarctica. Now, we fast forward post-war period to June 24th, 1947. Anybody know what happened on that date? Kenneth Arnold made the first sighting of what was then called a flying saucer over Mount Rainier. Now, I live in this area right now, hopefully temporarily. I've lived in both here and Seattle fairly frequently. And this, of course, is very famous. Now, Kenneth Arnold made a report to the Army, to the Air Force, Army Air Force at the time, and said he saw a bunch of different objects. Some of them were sort of wedge-shaped. And I don't know why that's a wedge slide. Oh, here we go. But some of them were crescent-shaped. And what was really interesting to me about these crescent shapes, there's the wedge shape, there's the crescent shape, is that they looked really familiar. And, at the time he said, look, I saw these supersonic objects, they skipped around like saucers on the water. The term flying saucers was coined, it kind of took off from there. But this is the shape that he said they appeared to have. Now, couldn't see very clearly, they were actually several miles away. And they were kind of this weird crescent shape. Now, they reminded me of the war machines in the War of the Worlds, but without, of course, the little telescoping eye things. They looked kind of like that, and I thought, that's really weird. And then they were used, same models were used in a later movie called Robinson Crusoe on Mars. Anybody ever seen that movie? Yeah, it's a terrible movie. Watch it anyway. It's kind of got some interesting stuff in it. Interesting concepts of what Mars was really like. He walks around Mars in his shirt sleeves, which at 140 below at night is kind of unlikely, but they didn't know much about Mars back then, or at least they say they did. But it was a really familiar shape to me, and I'm like, there's something that's bugging me about this. I don't know what it is. So I started looking around and seeing what other people had talked about this, and they said, well, look, if you look at Kenneth Arnold's flying saucer, it bears a strong resemblance to this particular aircraft, which is the Horton HO-229. It was a prototype development of a flying wing aircraft that the Nazis were working on at the end of World War II. The Nazis were way ahead of us in aviation technology. They built the Me-262, the world's first actual jet fighter. And one of the great stories about the Me-262 is that it was so fast, 200 miles an hour faster than American fighters, that they could have done anything they wanted with them. But as Chuck Yeager said, fortunately Hitler was an idiot, because Hitler used these fighters to drop bombs on the Americans, like drop one 500-pound bomb on the Americans, as opposed to had he just put guns on it and shot down all the American bombers, which they could have easily done. Germany's technological, industrial development capabilities would have been protected, and they could have actually survived probably World War II. But Hitler, instead, he wanted it to be an offensive weapon. But This was the actual HO-229 prototype. It was made of wood. That's what they used to do with mock-ups, is they would build them of wood, and there were plans that had been completed for much larger versions, a third and a fourth larger version. This is the one that was captured by the Americans at the end of World War II. Here's another photograph of the rear end of it. And it was basically an extremely revolutionary design. Now, it still exists. This is the central part of the body. The wings are still there. It's being restored in the Smithsonian based on the plans. They're going to rebuild this thing and put it in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. Kind of like what they did with the Enterprise from the original Star Trek series. But the HO-229 is, of course, an early development of what later became our B-2 stealth bomber. Now, why is it that flying wings were experimented with at the end of World War II, and then we didn't see them again until 1992, 40, 50 years later, when the B-2 came out? And the reason is that flying wings are inherently unstable. Okay, they are hard to control. They're all over the place because they don't have a tail. There's no stability, lateral stability. So until we develop something called fly-by-wire technology, which is basically using fiber optic cables and computers to make miniature adjustments constantly, thousands of times a second, on all the airframes, we couldn't make a flying wing work. They crashed, they wobbled, they skipped. Well, guess what? When Kenneth Arnold talked about what his crescent-shaped objects were doing is they were wobbling and skipping and doing all this kind of stuff. So what I begin to think is that, and by the way, where this was all happening was near McChord Air Force Base near Seattle, Washington, between Seattle and Tacoma, now out near Mount Rainier. Now today this is a populated area, but in 1947, there were like crickets living out there. There was nothing there. There were no people. So it was a great place. If you were going to build a flying wing aircraft and test it, McChord is one of the most remote places in the continental United States where you could do that testing. Unfortunately, Kenneth Arnold seems to have been up in the air and spotted this thing, or some development of it, and talked about it. Now, this is another further aircraft, that was spotted near Cincinnati. It's the wedge shape that he described. In other words, there are two different kind of airplanes. This is another different development of the idea, kind of what's now called a lifting body, or was called in the 60s a lifting body with a light underneath it. These are a bunch of different photos of it. There were reports coming in from all over the country at that time. Cincinnati, Chicago, the Southwest. All of a sudden, everybody started seeing flying saucers. And again, the Lubbock lights, things like that came through. It was a different time period, but the same kind of thing. There's photographs. Tulsa had some weird lights and things flying around. Everybody began seeing flying saucers after Arnold made his report. And then the big one. In 2 weeks after Arnold's sighting, what happened, Jose?
UFO crash at Roswell.
A UFO crashed at Roswell, or something crashed in Roswell, New Mexico. And by the way, where are you from, Jose?
Roswell, New Mexico.
Where's Edgar Mitchell from, the sixth man to walk on the moon?
He's from Roswell.
Roswell, New Mexico. Yeah, kind of a pattern there, I guess. I don't know. Katy Perry's also from Roswell. No, it's not true.
So's Demi Moore.
Demi Moore. Demi Moore is from Roswell.
And Bruce Willis was at the military.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, Bruce Willis and Demi.
Sure.
Demi. So we all know what happened, right? We've heard the story, or at least if you haven't heard the story, I'll tell it to you very, very quickly. Basically, something crashed on a rancher named Mac Brazel's ranch. The Army went out there, they recovered it. They said, it's a flying saucer. We have one, we've got it captured, and we're going to tell you all about it tomorrow. Well, the next day, when they showed up for the press conference, there's, again, the Roswell Daily Record, captured a flying saucer on a ranch in Roswell region. This is what the paper said. It went all over the world. There were stories that it was a crashed disc and there were alien bodies and all that stuff that looked, like your classical kind of grays. And the next day they held a press conference and they said, oh, sorry, we were wrong. It's not a flying saucer. It's a weather balloon. And they trotted out all this fake stuff, which both of these men, Major Jesse Marcel and General Ramey, later said this was not what they recovered at the crash site. This was actual weather balloon stuff that they had torn up to make it look like this is what it crashed. And they told this to the press. Now, this is really interesting to me because one of the things that General Ramey did, which I found fascinating, is he held this memo in his hand. See that right there? And he held it in such a way that anybody taking a photograph of the press conference could theoretically see what was written on the memo. Now, there are a lot of disputes about what is actually written on the memo. This is an example of some photoshopping that's been done, but a couple of the interpretations are some very sort of vague stuff, but there's discussion of the disc that Hout, this is Major General George Hout, is that correct, Jose?
Yeah,
Hout sent the blah, blah, blah advisory, being caught, tower may arrive shortly at Roswell, but it talks about the disc. Next you could talk about weather balloons, blah, 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 but then in this particular picture, the words have been interpreted as saying, and the victims of the wreck. In the disc they will ship, meaning that what he's got there is a memo from probably his higher-ups in DC telling him, yeah, ship us the disc and give us this material and store the victims on ice, probably, something like that. And years later, Jesse Marcel came out and told his story. I think it was first saw it on In Search Of, which is an old show that Leonard Nimoy of Star Trek fame narrated, and gave some interviews with Stan Friedman and basically said, no, it was a flying saucer. It was this sucker. Something like this. Now, in the 1950s then, there was this big investigation. People came out, like General Twining, Nathan Twining, former Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, talked about things. They used to be able to get away with saying stuff publicly. They said stuff like, this flying saucer situation is not at all imaginary or seeing too much in some natural phenomenon. Something is really flying around. The phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious. At the same time, in the early 50s, you had this group of cheery guys working for the military. That happy man right there is Hermann Oberth. Hermann Oberth was Wernher von Braun, Dr. Wernher von Braun's mentor and instructor for his doctoral thesis on rocketry. He was the leading German expert at rocketry. We got him and von Braun. Von Braun was the brilliant engineer. Oberth was the conceptual scientist at the top. And Oberth said, we can't take credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We've been helped. And then he was asked in this interview, who helped you? And he said, the people of other worlds. So maybe that picture of Hitler and the alien isn't really a fake. Maybe it's real. And there's also another quote from Oberth where he's on record as saying, it's my thesis that flying saucers are real and that they are spaceships from another solar system. There's no doubt in my mind that these objects are interplanetary craft of some sort. I and my colleagues, that would be Dr. von Braun, are confident that they do not originate in our solar system. So he came out and said that we got all these advancements from the aliens. Now, Wernher von Braun's a really great guy. Here he is during his early days in the 1930s. That's Adolf Hitler, and that's Wernher von Braun. There he is, here in the picture. Here he is in his SS uniform. This is the only picture known to exist of Dr. Wernher von Braun. And for those of you who are young and don't know who von Braun was, he was the guy who basically designed all of the rockets that took Americans to the moon. And yes, we did go to the moon, and he designed all the rockets, the Saturn V's. We would not have made it to the moon and back without Wernher von Braun. This guy is Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's number 2, and this is Wernher von Braun. They were buddies. They were personal friends. So von Braun was actually a member of the SS. What was the SS? It was a mystical secret society that grew out of the Vril Society. Remember Maria Orsic and all her girls? Sort of a coven. They grew out of that into the SS, and there's a close-up of him and his buddy. And, once they were captured and brought to the U.S., they went to Fort Bliss, Texas, for instance, and they made no secret of where their allegiances were. Their allegiances were still to Nazi Germany. Here they are, a bunch of these guys that were captured, brought into America under Operation Paperclip. And if you look at this thing above them in the saloon, it's a flying saucer. And, where's the other picture? And if you look at the flying saucer, it has a swastika on it. So they were making no mistake of it at all. There were other crashes that happened. This is supposedly a photograph of a crash in Russia, in communist Russia, sort of the Russian Roswell. There was the 1942 Cape Girardeau crash, where according to a preacher, he was brought to the site of the crash of a flying disc, and it was William Huffman, Southern Baptist Reverend, and was told to give last rites to alien bodies that were there. Here's his drawing, or a drawing, of what he saw. They held up the aliens, they took pictures of them, he gave them the last rite. Now, tomorrow I'm going to go down to MUFON OC, I'm going to hang out with Dr. Bob Wood. He's a documents expert, but what he found was documents that showed that in that 1942 crash, one of the things they found were fiber optics. They found these weird filaments of glass and polymer, plastic, that used light to transmit information. It later became what we call today fiber optics, which is one of the things that made flying wings actually possible. Now, after that, in 1952, we had this incident, which was the buzzing of Washington, D.C. over 2 consecutive weekends, July 12th and I think 13th, and then the 19th and 20th. July 20th is really interesting because we had UFOs buzzing the Capitol on July 20th. It's an ancient Egyptian ritual date. It was of great importance. We landed on the moon on that day. It just seems to come up all the time to NASA. And what happened is that there were a bunch of these objects that were spotted on radar appearing from the south, approaching Washington, D.C. They flew over the Capitol. They were tracked on radar. The explanation was later given, they were temperature inversions and you guys were tracking weather. And all of the guys that were in the tower said categorically, absolutely, we've seen temperature inversions, we know what they look like. That's not what these were. These were solid metallic objects. And this is not actual photograph of DC, but it's a representation of what happened in 52. And basically they flew around. Fighter jets were scrambled. The fighter jets could not get anywhere near the UFOs. This, by the way, is a really famous picture of a flying saucer tracking a US fighter. And it was a sensation. The Washington Post, back when anybody believed what was in it, actually ran a story about how the saucer outran a jet. The pilot said, hey, whatever it was, it outran me. It scared the crap out of me. And some people think that these were actually Nazi flying saucers that came up from Antarctica to demonstrate to the United States that they were still around and they had power. And they were able to come here and fly around our skies with impunity. The Capitol was buzzed. It happened again the next weekend. It was even more dramatic. Again, the guy said that, look, the good solid returns on our radar scopes were just definitely solid and not weather. They made 90-degree turns, sometimes 2 times, 90 degrees, at thousands of miles an hour. They did things on radar that were absolutely impossible. There were eyewitnesses that saw this, that corroborated from the ground. There were rumors that the pilots were told, if you get anywhere near these things, shoot them down. They tried to get near them. They couldn't get near the flying saucers. This, I think, is one of the few photos that might be real of the actual buzzing of the Capitol. But it went on for 2 consecutive weeks. Here's another one of one of the flying objects over the Capitol. And it got to the point where the president had to address it. So imagine if the current president actually had to come out and say, in the last 2 weeks, the flying saucers over the Capitol, we really don't know what they are. He actually said, I can assure you that flying saucers, given that they exist, are not constructed by any power on Earth. So President Truman said, whatever these things are, they're not Russian, and they're not ours. So he was trying to cool people down and say they're not German or anything. And then he said, we discussed at this conference that we had with the military that, something weird's going on, and we're going to take measures to address this. So what they did is they got Project Blue Book going. They assigned some people to investigate it, including Richard Nixon got involved with looking at some of the film. That's an actual picture of him looking at some of the film of these flying saucers. And of course, there's a story again that they took gun camera footage of these things with their fighters, and all that stuff has disappeared. And eventually, what happened was that the whole thing just kind of died out. But imagine if you're the US government and you've reached a point where we thought we defeated Nazi Germany, we chased them to Antarctica, we tried to get to their plant in Silesia, but we didn't make it, they escaped. We chased them to Antarctica, we got our forces' butts kicked, by these weird flying disc things. We found this flying wing, this incredible aircraft that we can't even come close to matching the technology. And then a few years later, we got crashes in Roswell, New Mexico. We had a previous crash in Cape Girardeau, and then the Capitol got buzzed by flying discs. So at this point, behind the scenes, they were probably freaking out. The question is, what did they know and when did they know it? Now, one of the things that happened after that was that there was apparently the formation of an organization called MJ12. Different people have had different opinions on whether MJ12 really exists. But what happened was in the 1980s, a UFO researcher, I think Jamie Chanderay, got these documents, these top secret magic eyes-only documents, which was a presidential briefing for actually President-elect Eisenhower, not Truman. But it was supposedly information that Truman had obtained from 1947 forward. And in these documents, they talked about that there was a crash in Roswell, New Mexico, that they had formed an organization to deal with all this stuff, and that organization was called MJ or Majestic 12. And it listed the members, a bunch of military members, including General Twining, the guy who was quoted earlier, was considered to be one of the members. And here are all the guys. One of the guys I find most fascinating is this guy here, Dr. Donald Menzel. And people say, well, there's no way Menzel could be a member because Menzel was like Carl Sagan or Neil deGrasse Tyson is in modern times. He's a debunker. He mocked UFOs. Well, that was his job at MJ12. Now, Dr. Menzel also worked at, he was a professor at Harvard, a physicist at Harvard. One of his students that he mentored was named Dr. Carl Sagan. When Menzel died in 1972, Carl Sagan suddenly changed opinions. He used to be fascinated before that by alien life, by UFOs, by flying saucers. He talked to J. Allen Hynek about it on many occasions. Richard Hoagland has told me that they had some meetings about the face on Mars and stuff in the 80s. But in 72, after Menzel died, suddenly Sagan became the debunker. He took over Menzel's role as the primary scientific debunker of UFOs and UFO sightings, almost as if he became a member or took the chair that Menzel had left empty on MJ12. Now, as you go through these documents, there's some pretty fascinating stuff. There's a order, basically an order. There's other documents that have been signed by Truman that have said, we're going to have a meeting of the MJ12 committee today, everybody be there. So there's lots of supporting documents that have been found that show that actually MJ12 did exist. Now, one of the big arguments that it doesn't exist is they say, well, Truman's signature is exactly the same on this document as it is on some other documents, so it's a forgery. But actually what happened was that presidents had the use of a device where they would have a pen that would be attached to like 10 other pens. They would have 10 documents and the president would sign it once and all 10 of them would be signed. Because everything was paper back then, there was no digital signature. So that doesn't really add up. So the argument's gone back and forth on the MJ12 stuff, but there's a lot of supporting information. And then you get to, later on, what was called the Byrne Memo. And the reason it's called the Byrne Memo is because it's burned. Anybody know about the Byrne Memo? Everybody? Jose does, right?
Yeah.
Supposedly this was retrieved from somebody's fire, and it was a top secret magic document, and it talked about somebody named Lancer in there. Now, John F. Kennedy, when he came into office in 1960, said, among other things, that the US and the Soviet Union should work together to go to the moon. He felt that this was an important project for us to do together, that no one country should go to the moon, no one country should make the discoveries, and he proposed this to Khrushchev twice in private and once in public in the UN in 1963. His Secret Service code name was Lancer. So, and again, I covered this in Ancient Aliens and Secret Societies. So, as you go back to the Byrne Memo, what it says actually is, as you know, Lancer has been making inquiries as to our activities, and this is something we, of course, cannot allow, or something to that effect. So what they're saying is, we cannot allow President Kennedy to know what we're doing. So here's what I think happened. All this other stuff took place. The national security state was essentially created in the 1950s. The CIA, the NSA, The National Reconnaissance Office, which didn't become public for 30 or 40 more years. These were all created, and all this technology that they had taken from these crash flying saucers and from the Germans, maybe that they made a deal with after the Washington buzzing, I don't know. The secret space program kind of went off on its own in the intelligence circles, and at some point, they decided that presidents were no longer going to be included in MJ-12. They were no longer going to be allowed in. Kennedy was refused access to the information. So what I think Kennedy decided was, okay, excuse my Greek, fuck you. I'm going to make my own secret space program. And that's when he decided that we were going to go to the moon. And then he wanted the Russians to help him out. The idea was that, again, this is what I talk about in secret societies. The idea was that there's technology on the moon. There's alien technology on the moon. Maybe it's Anunnaki, as according to Sitchin. Maybe it's some other aliens. Maybe it's the Greys. But everybody knew there was stuff there. So what he decided he was going to do was create a public space program built around rockets that was going to go to the moon and retrieve the alien technology that was there and bring it back and reverse engineer it so that his side, the public side, the republic side maybe, would have this access to the same technology that the German, Nazi, NSA, CIA side did. Of course, we know what happened. After he made this proposal to Khrushchev accepted it. His son, Sergei, says that in early November of 1963, he accepted it. 10 days later, after Kennedy issued a couple of national security action memos, he was killed. Now, the memos are really interesting because what they say is they direct the CIA to open an office to start sharing information with the Russians. There's a so-called secret national security action memo that says we want them to make sure that they know all about our experimental aircraft because we don't want them to mistake our experimental aircraft for bona fide UFOs. Now, some people say, oh, well, Kennedy was going to reveal UFOs to the public. No, he wasn't. What he was going to do is he was going to create his own separate secret agenda, hidden agenda space program to go to the moon. The public cover was we're going to go to the moon for political purposes. The private purpose was to go there and retrieve technology and get caught up with what the secret government was doing. Now, again, this is not an easy picture to look at, but, you know, the assassination of President Kennedy. What people don't know is that there are a couple of photographs that were taken of the grassy knoll area. There's always been the big argument. Was it Lee Harvey Oswald in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, or was it somebody on the grassy knoll shooting at him? The answer is it was both. Oswald fired from the School Book Depository. He fired the shot that hit Kennedy in the back and exited his neck. Now, what most people don't know is that President Kennedy would have been killed by that anyway, because it severed the nerve in his body that tells the heart to beat. So he was already dead the minute he was hit with that shot. A few seconds later, he was hit with the headshot, which clearly we've all seen the motion back and to the left. It came from somewhere else, which is the grassy knoll. Now, there's a photograph of the grassy knoll called the Mary Moorman photograph. And on that photograph, there is a figure that has been found through photo enhancement, modern photo enhancement, of a guy called Badge Man. Now, when you do color enhancement, this is the so-called Badge Man character.
And George Herbert Walker Bush loading them.
George what? George Bush?
Herbert Walker Bush loading the car.
Yeah, actually, I've got a picture of Bush actually in Dealey Plaza, as was Jack Ruby, who the Warren Commission said was not actually there. But there's a photograph of him there. But this Badge Man guy, this is a Dallas policeman's uniform. This is his badge. This is his arm emblem. And that right there is a muzzle blast. See, these are his elbows. So what he's doing is this. You're seeing a guy holding a rifle like that. You look at his face. There's his head, his ear, his eyes. There's two other figures near him. The interesting one is this one, because there's a guy named Gordon Arnold who, let me just scan forward a little bit. Oh, anti-gravity. There's a guy, damn it, I was doing a flow that. There's a guy named Gordon Arnold. And there's a show, you can look it up on YouTube, it's called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And type The Men Who Killed Kennedy, Gordon Arnold, and you can watch The only interviews that were ever done with this guy is a 1992 show that was on A&E, I believe. And in it, he tells the story that he had just come out of basic training. He was in Dallas visiting his mom before he was going to go on to his duty station in Alaska. And he took his mom's film camera and he went down to watch what he thought was a parade. It turned out it was the Kennedy procession. He didn't know the president was in town. And he was sitting there filming with his mom's camera, and a shot went right past his ear. And he hit the ground, and he was actually seen hitting the ground by Senator Clayton Yarborough at the time, who was in the motorcade. He saw this guy hit the ground. And he said, this guy came around the corner, and he had a rifle, and he pointed it at me, and he was dressed like a Dallas policeman, but he didn't have a hat on. And he told me, he asked me, were you filming? And I said, yes. And he said, give me your camera. He said, I'm not giving you my camera. And the guy pointed the gun at me and said, you can have the film, though. So he took the film, tore it out, and the guy ran around. Now, this was 4 years before the Mary Moorman photograph was analyzed and enhanced. So this guy right here is Kenneth Arnold, the man who told the story. This is a camouflage army uniform of the time. This is his hand. He's holding it in front of his camera, in front of his face. This is his, little off-duty cap that they would wear in the army. There's an emblem on it. And this is the guy he described. Notice Dallas policeman's uniform, badge, emblem, and no hat. Exactly as Arnold described, which was all figured out some 35 years later. So when you have a conspiracy, you have two guys shooting, you have a conspiracy. So there was a conspiracy to kill JFK. And I talk about that a lot in Secret Societies, not so much in Hidden Agenda. But I just want to show you one other thing. Right after Oswald shot at Kennedy, he left the school book depository and went back towards his house. He was confronted, supposedly, by a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit. Okay? J.D. Tippit had a very specific kind of male pattern baldness going. He had very thick eyebrows. He had sort of prominent ears. And you look at this badge man guy, and he's got the same ears and the same eyebrows and the exact same male pattern baldness. Now, again, there's other enhancements. I didn't put them in the slideshow that very clearly show that this is the same guy. So the policeman that shot at Kennedy from the grassy knoll and hit him with a headshot was probably, I'm 99% sure, was J.D. Tippit. Oswald then meets Tippit somewhere else, two assassins. Tippit thinks he's going to pick up Oswald or take him somewhere. Instead, Oswald kills Tippit. Ruby kills Oswald. Ruby becomes the single point failure. He never talks. And nobody ever knows what really happened the day that John F. Kennedy was killed. But the reason for it is that he was going to share with the Russians what we found on the moon. And again, that's Ancient Aliens on the Moon. You can read that book and find that out. Now, how does this lead into anti-gravity? Anti-gravity is an amazing thing. Thank you, Kate Upton, for demonstrating what anti-gravity looks like. But the purpose of this is the anti-gravity technology. Now, over the years, there's been a lot of information that's come out about anti-gravity research in the 1950s. And we were developing basically triangular craft. Now, there are some actual official TR-3B is an aircraft that is triangular shaped. It's been developed by the U.S. government. There's been photographs or films of it that may or may not be the TR-3, our own development aircraft. There are some other photographs of these triangular shaped craft being escorted by other military aircraft. This is something called the UCAS or JUCAS. It's the Unmanned Combat Air System. I know this exists because I worked on it. All right. There was other aircraft that were developed along these lines as far back as the late 1980s. There was a program called the A-12 that was canceled by Dick Cheney because it was overweight and over budget. In the aerospace industry, we have a saying: if it's overweight and over budget, that's how you know it's an airplane. So I don't know why Cheney canceled it, but the bottom line is that if it's shaped like a triangle, it's probably one of ours. If it's shaped like a disc, it's probably one of theirs. So if you're out there looking around and you see a triangle, I'm thinking most of the time you're seeing our actual craft. Ours, theirs. Ours, theirs. Now, the whole thing is kind of interesting. It's like, okay, this is interesting. We've got these Germans developing this technology. It's feasible. We had it by the 40s or 50s. But what did we do with it? I mean, how did this all work? Well, we started working on our own flying saucer technology in the 40s and in the 50s. And there was actually, stories about it, how aerospace companies were hiring people to work on anti-gravity. There's a couple of different articles in different magazines about how anti-gravity drives might work. But the work that was the most interesting was by a guy named T. Townsend Brown. Anybody heard of T. Townsend Brown? One person. That's really sad, because T. Townsend Brown was a genius. What he figured out was that if you took a disc shape and you hit it with really, really intense electricity, highly charged electrical particles, what you would get, and Brown and Byfield worked on it together, what you would get was all of the positively charged stuff would go to the front of the disc, or one side of the disc, and all the negative stuff, negatively charged stuff, would go to the back. I don't know a lot about electromagnetism, so I don't really want to mess myself up here. But the bottom line was, what he thought it was doing was the disc then would move in the direction of the positively charged end. And eventually what would happen is that everything would stabilize and even out, and then the movement would stop. So what he came up with is that, well, what you do is you keep recharging it. You keep hitting it with this electrical voltage over and over and over again, and the thing would move, which is theoretically impossible. It was tested in vacuum chambers. People are trying to say, oh, well, there was a little bit of air in the vacuum chambers. No, nonsense. What he thinks happened was that basically you had a gravity hill formed in the negatively charged end and a gravity well to the front. So basically, the thing would surf on a wave of gravity that was created simply by charging the disc shape with high voltage electricity. So that's basically the warp drive in Star Trek. That's the idea behind it. And he conducted all kinds of experiments. He created what he called gravitators. He worked on different shapes. He found the disc to be the most effective. What he found is the more massive the disc was, the better the effect worked. He developed several patents that were granted for his devices. And he tried to get these experiments done. This is all in the 1920s. He tried to get experiments, financed by different people. Some people gave him money, and then they pulled their money out. And he eventually developed this is another patent that he had for 2 discs on a free-swinging pendulum, and when he would charge them up, they would take off in one direction. And he was thinking, well, you could make anti-gravity work with this. And again, the idea is you just create this deformation of space, a gravity force, and the thing is going to go in the direction of the force. This is exactly now what NASA is saying they're developing in their so-called warp drive or faster-than-light spaceships. This is a NASA diagram of how theirs is going to work. It's kind of shaped like a football. Now, the advantages of this system are enormous. You could basically accelerate to near light or more than light speed. There's no reason in this model of the universe why you couldn't accelerate beyond the speed of light. I mean, remember, that's all on a chalkboard. The idea that you can't go faster than the speed of light is all on a chalkboard. It's not anything that's ever been proven in reality. And the idea would be that you just need electrical charge to make things go almost as fast as you want. The more electricity you put into it, the faster it's going to go. And it's actually very easy to develop this much electricity. You can just use solar panels. So you could build a spacecraft that would be bigger than a space shuttle. It could go to Mars in 5 days. You could have a 100-ton ship. The total cost of one trip to Mars, 55 million kilometers, would be about 360 kilowatt hours, which would cost you, according to Paul LaViolette, who's great, he's got a great video about this, $25 to go to Mars, as opposed to the fuel costs of the space shuttle, which would be 450 million just to get it up into orbit. So it's cheaper, obviously. Now, this is, again, he also says, hey, there's no reason you couldn't go to the stars. You could go to Alpha Centauri, the nearest star system, in just a few months. You could even go faster than that if you wanted to, but you basically would accelerate and then coast and then decelerate, and you're in another star system. You could travel the stars. And again, this stuff's kind of, the power cost is really cheap. These are kind of, I'm sorry, it's just the projector, it's not translating really, really well. But the bottom line is that he saw no reason why you couldn't make something go basically what would be the equivalent of warp factor 5 on Star Trek, which was pretty fast. Get you to Alpha Centauri in about 3 or 4 days. But what he did is he created a proposal for what he called Project Winter Haven, which was the idea that I want to build flying saucers for the U.S. government. So he took it to the Navy. This is the actual cover of the proposal, Project 1794. And he said, look, I'm going to use all this technology. Notice this looks a lot like a Nazi flying saucer. And this is how it's going to work. There's going to be some rockets. There's going to be some different vortex stuff to control it in the atmosphere. And we're going to make these really super cool flying saucers. We can scale it all up, and we can make them do all kinds of stuff, exactly what these people are saying that they see in these UFO sightings. We can meet the aliens on their own terms. This is about 1958. And the Navy said, thanks very much. They took his study, which was, I think, 34 pages long. And he never heard from them again. But one thing did happen, is that there was open discussion of anti-gravity in the scientific journals, in the papers of the day, and all these aerospace companies were hiring scientists and engineers to work on anti-gravity. In 1958, right after he dropped his proposal, about 6 months later, that all stopped, cut off. It just simply disappeared. So what happened was they took his ideas and they took them black. The secret space program absorbed this stuff. And then years later, there's a guy named Martin Clandish who said he went to an air show, or he sent a friend to an air show, and that he saw something called the ARV, the so-called ARV flux liner. Now the story is he went to this air show at Edwards out here near LA. They were taken to a private area where they were shown a craft that looked something like this. These are supposedly real pictures of something similar to the ARV. And that it could, also very similar to the repulsing, and that it could fly, maneuver, and do all these kinds of things. It had 2 seats at the top. This was our primitively developed flying saucer technology. Now, I think that this stuff from the 80s is probably the outgrowth of the Kennedy initiative, the Kennedy program, which was separate. But one of the things that was interesting is they saw these canisters. He saw these canisters on the first deck. There was an actual cutaway of one of these things. Now, what could be in the canisters? And it occurred to me, the Sonora Air Club's NB gas or Zerum 525 or red mercury might be in those canisters and had something to do with the properties. Now these ARVs actually flew around and did all the maneuvers you would expect a flying saucer to do. Later on, of course, Bob Lazar talked about the sport model and the different things that it could do. There's some similarity, but they're clearly 2 different designs. They come from 2 different sources. One, I suspect, alien. One, probably developed through our own kind of clumsy rebuilding of their technology. And again, there's very distinct similarities between these 2 projects. Now, to me, the biggest proof that you need that there's a secret space program is this graph right here. I have actually a better version of it in the book, which I've lost, so I couldn't put it in the slideshow. But here's what you're looking at. You're looking at the development of speed. You're looking at the development of transportation speed. Basically, from Roman times up to about up to the 1800s, basically the horse and buggy was probably the fastest thing on Earth. Nothing could go faster, right? 20 some miles an hour. Then you had the development of the train, steam train, and then you had the development of primitive airplanes, and then you had the development of rockets. So basically, you go from 20 or 30 miles an hour to a maximum speed of about 18,000 miles an hour in the course of between 1850 and 1960, so a little over 100 years. The trend curve is straight up. Since then, if you believe NASA and you believe mainstream science, this curve basically went straight up and then it's gone flat since 1960. So since 1960, 70 years ago now, we've had, almost 70 years, we've had no new technological transportational breakthroughs. Nothing. But if you look at that curve, that's not possible. We should have, around 1960, made the next discovery. And the next discovery was probably anti-gravity. They just took it secret and didn't tell us about it. However, private citizens have continued to do research. There's something new called the EM drive, or electromagnetic drive. It's also called a Cannae drive. The Chinese have done research in this. They say it works. There's been private companies that have done research into this. They say it works. NASA has built their own versions of this. They say it works. What is it? Well, it's just this thing. And again, all they do is here it is in the test rig, the resonant cavity thruster. What this means is it's a reactionless drive. In other words, you get forward motion without any thrust. You don't put any energy into it. All they do is bounce microwaves around the inside of this thing, and it moves in the opposite direction of the wide end. It moves forward. It's a very small thrust, but this defies all of the so-called laws of physics of motion. In other words, you get movement and thrust without putting anything into it. So you're getting almost free energy. All you have to do is, again, get a few solar panels or generate some electrical energy to bounce some microwaves around the inside of this thing. It's being developed now or studied by NASA, by private developers, and this is what happens to microwaves. They just bounce around the inside of this sucker and the whole assembly moves forward. So this is, again, identical, I think, to what Townsend Brown developed with the idea of distorting gravity and everything moving in a certain forward motion. Now, okay, logically, if this really happened, if there really is ARVs and there really is flying saucer technology owned by the U.S. government, we would probably see it, right? There'd be some evidence of it. So now I'm going to show you what I think is evidence of these actual craft. The first video I'm going to show you is STS-48. It's a space shuttle mission from the early 1990s. And it's going to show you some really, really unusual stuff. Hang on. And then all of a sudden, bang, flash, shot, and I'm going to make. Now this is the first one, the STS-48, where the thing comes up and it makes a 45-degree turn, and these shots go past it. Dr. Jack Kasher, a physicist at University of Nebraska, analyzed this, and he said, hey, the bottom line is that as he tracked each of the objects on there, they had different changes of direction, and what actually happened with the primary object is right before it made the 45-degree angle turn, it actually came to a complete stop for 2 seconds. Sorry, 0.5 seconds. So again, nothing in space can come to a complete stop unless it is a powered vehicle. The STS-80 stuff was the same thing. You had the weird tadpole which shot up out of Santiago, Chile. What was that? I don't know. And then you had the main object which kept stationing with the shuttle. I don't think the aliens were to call up NASA and say, hey, guess what? We're going to be over Santiago, Chile at exactly 7:19 GMT time tonight if you want to videotape this. But if you wanted to test weapons systems against alien invaders, these 2 shots that you saw, you might want to record that. And the shuttle might be the perfect way to do it. Now, right below the area where this video was taken is a U.S. military CIA base in Australia. I forget the name of it. Pine Gap. Thank you. I just remembered. Pine Gap, where those shots probably came from. So I think you're looking at our technology that we developed that's been kept secret now for 50, 60, 70 years. Okay, one last thing I wanted to go into, because we are probably over time, right? Are we getting really late here? Do I need to stop? There's something, the secret space program can mean a lot of different things. And one of them is that we could have been doing things secretly on the moon missions, for instance, that, people didn't really know what was going on. One of the things that happened is that on the mission of Apollo 12, we landed in the ocean of storms, and Apollo 12 is really weird because it landed only about 122 miles away from where Apollo 14 landed later, and it really doesn't make any scientific sense to land in the same place twice. If you're only going there to do studies of rocks, why would you want to study rocks from the same location. If you're going to land on the moon, you want to land all over the place and get different samples. But Apollo 12 and Apollo 14 basically landed in the same place. Now, one of the things that I've argued in the Moon Book and in Dark Mission is that there are these gigantic glass structures on the moon, made of something like glass, that were basically designed to be there as a meteor shield. Here's some images from Apollo 14 of some very large, weird structures over the horizon of the moon from the landing site. Some of them come in diagonally like this. There's other vertical stuff. These are not scratches on the negatives or anything like that. They're actual structural pieces. Here is a 16 millimeter film of Apollo 12. And again, it's the same thing. You see the same structure. So what you're actually looking at, I think, is the same pieces of this structure probably north of both of those sites, because they're probably right up in here somewhere. So what I think this looks like is this. This is a 3D model of this scaffolding structure, and it was basically meant just to protect whatever was there on the moon. Now, when you look at stuff NASA puts out, there's a lot of deception in it. This is what they say is dirt or dust running down the side of the crater. But see, I don't trust them very much. So I like to do things like flip their pictures upside down. And when you flip this picture upside down, you don't see streaks down the side of a crater. What you see is this crystalline structure sticking up out of the ground in 3D. See, this is a front wall here. There's a chasm in between. There's more of it there. This is all crystalline, this glass stuff that's been beaten down by centuries and centuries, millions of years of erosion. Here's a photograph of from Apollo 15 of the surface of the moon as the astronauts were flying back to Earth. Now, there's one thing about this that really bugs me, and it should bug you too, because in the vacuum of space, if the moon has no atmosphere, you should look at the edge of the lunar disk and you should see a sharp edge and absolute blackness beyond it, but you don't see that. What you see is this light greenish, gauzy haze around the moon. That cannot be there. It can only be one of two things. Either the moon actually has an atmosphere, or it's that glass structural stuff. And even notice some of it's thinner in some areas and thicker in others, where it's been beaten down by meteors and other strikes. The point of that was that on Apollo 12, what we've now established is that they did what's called a stand-up EVA. That's where, when they landed on the moon, they pretended to be taking on some certain task, and this is covered in the book. They pretended they were going to do certain things, like take care of some house cleaning tasks. What they really did was they popped the top of the lunar module open, and they got up and they looked around because they wanted to see what you would be able to see on the TV screens, if you could see this glass stuff in the background. And if you remember Apollo 11, it was the most horrible, terrible video you've ever seen. You couldn't tell anything, you couldn't see anything in the background. But Apollo 12 actually had a color camera that was much, much better than the black and white camera that was on Apollo 14. What they did on Apollo 12 was they did this secret EVA. They looked around. They obviously went, oh, crap, we can't show them this at home. So what happened was that when Bean and Conrad descended from the ladder, the first thing they did basically is Al Bean took the camera and he did the exact one thing he was trained not to do. He pointed it right into the sun and burned out the optics. So we have virtually no television at all from Apollo 12. So anyway, the point that I wanted to make with this is that I think what happened was that there was this secret space program developing technology that was probably captured by the intelligence agencies from the different Roswell crashes, the Cape Girardeau crash, other sources like that. The Germans contributed the knowledge that they had gotten from the aliens. I mean, the Germans flat out said, Oberth said, we got it from aliens, people from other worlds. And Kennedy came in, found out that he couldn't get access to this technology. And so he created his own separate second space program, and basically went to the moon to try to retrieve this ancient technology and bring it back to Earth and develop our own flying saucer systems, which I think is what the space shuttle was actually taking videos of, because NASA was that end. They were that, that was their assignment, was to be the cover for that second secret space program. So if you have two secret space programs, God only knows what we could have developed behind the scenes and what we have today. The last part of the book is going to deal with other people that talk about the secret space program. Now, what I've showed you today is what I think is most of the best evidence that it actually exists. I also go through, there's a couple of transcripts in there of some of the Project Serpo stuff, which I think is legitimate. And the biggest reason I think MJ12 and Serpo are both legitimate is because of the fact that if you look at the absolute depth of complexity of what's on Serpo, including there's a transcript of a supposed briefing that President Reagan was given about aliens in 1981. It goes into such incredible detail that it would take literally tens of thousands of hours to create all the content that's there, all the notes, all the stuff that's there. And people say it's a hoax. People say it's a prank. Okay, well, isn't the point of a hoax that at some point you say, guess what, I made the whole thing up. Look at how smart and clever I am. I fooled you all. So you're saying that the Project Serpo guys, whoever they were, created this gigantic hoax, left it up on the web for free for 10 years, and have never taken credit for it? Again, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. It could make sense if it was government sources leaking the information. But as I went through this, I found that this was the stuff that I could put my fingers on. This was the nuts and bolts stuff. I mean, you hear other people talk about, channeled information from the blue avians from Andromeda that are telling them about all this stuff about the secret space program, the secret space war, and again, there's no evidence of any of it. There's no evidence that anybody ever teleported to Mars with Barack Obama from a building in Redondo Beach, which bluntly I worked in, and there's no teleporter there. Okay, at least there may have been a teleporter there in the 1960s, but there isn't one now. It's just a bunch of other equipment, radar stuff. So I just felt like what I needed to do or wanted to do was to put out the information that I felt I could put my fingers on. And what I can tell you is I believe that there is some sort of private secret program that has a lot more advanced technology than they're giving us now. And again, I think the biggest example of that is the graph that shows you that as of 1960, basically we stopped getting any faster. We have had no propulsion breakthroughs for 70 years, and that's just not possible. How can we have breakthroughs in all these other areas, but we can't go faster than the chemical rockets that we invented in the 1950s and 60s?